Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Brief Global History of the Left by Shlomo Sand, translated by Robin McKay, narrated by Peter Lerman. Introduction. Equality as the Great Modern Myth. Equality is, therefore, at once the most natural thing and the most chimerical. Voltaire, Equality, Philosophical Dictionary, 1764. I was born on the left. My father was a lifelong communist and hoped that I would follow in his footsteps, and so very early on he enrolled me in the Israeli Communist Youth Movement. I grew up in the poverty-stricken Jaffa of the 1950s, a decade which saw the rise of anti-communism in Israel. Every year on the 1st of May, I marched dressed in a white shirt and red scarf. Out in the middle of the crowd, I would be worried sick about being spotted by other boys from my class, who I knew would then bully me at school. But then, the fact that I was walking alongside other boys and girls, including one girl with whom I happened to be in love, would ease my fears somewhat, and I would feel quite the little hero. The truth is that the boy I was in those distant days is still alive inside me. And yet, as early as 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact troops prompted me to break all ties with the communist movement. And, of course, the subsequent realization of the horrific legacy of the revolutions of the 20th century did not exactly encourage me to return to it. And yet I continue to think as a man of the left. Some of the faults of my writing, and perhaps some of its qualities, can be attributed to that original political stance, which I am still not prepared to give up. Despite all of the disappointments occasioned by the deviations and failures of the social struggles of the 20th century, a great gulf remains between the values that drive the left in all its various forms and those that fuel right-wingers of all stripes. I grew up in a family of modest means. My mother was a cleaning lady, my father a night watchman. When I was 16, I was obliged to abandon my studies to become a manual worker until my military service, and it was not until the age of 24 that I decided to take my school-leaving exam and enroll at university. Later, having obtained a doctorate, I found a position as a lecturer which allowed me to teach and do research. I like to think that the fact that I was in contact with members of the working class and was close to a number of movements on the organized left prevented me from ever idealizing the topics of my research. After many years teaching at Tel Aviv University, today as professor emeritus, I enjoy the material benefits of the middle class. Unwilling to forget my past, however, I remain very conscious that most human beings find themselves in a far worse situation than myself, and struggle hard every day to improve their lives and those of their children. Even as I write these words, I have just read in the paper that half of the world's population survives on less than $5 a day. Most of us never meet these people, which is no coincidence. Not far from where I live, there are folk whose basic civil, political, and social rights have been denied for 54 years. We hardly ever see these Palestinians, and when they do manage to find work in Israel, often as construction workers on meager wages, they are usually transparent or invisible, perched on scaffolding high above us, and we hear about them only when they fall off and plummet down onto the sidewalk. This is one of the sources of my constant attention to social history and its political expressions, constant and biased. As the British philosopher Bertrand Russell said, "A man without bias cannot write interesting history, if indeed such a man exists." I fully share his view on this matter. The end of the left? I am writing this text at a time when organized leftist movements around the world are in serious decline. Social movements still exist, and citizen rebellions continue to shake up many regimes. But this is not being translated into a gain in power on the part of the traditional left-wing parties, or in the creation of dynamic left-wing movements. Hegel told us that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk, meaning that a historical process can only be understood in retrospect, at the moment when it is at an end. Does this principle apply to the worldwide left today? I am not sure, and this book is a reflection of my uncertainty. Requiems for the left have been pronounced dozens of times already, but, like a phoenix, it is repeatedly reborn from the ashes, in unexpected places and at unexpected moments. At the beginning of the 21st century, however, the left seems increasingly old and tired. Its ideological arms tremble and grope as it tries to grasp the future. But before deciding whether it's time to bury it once and for all, it is important to briefly consider the many faces the left has worn and the metamorphoses it has undergone over the years. At this point in the book, I'm not going to put forward any unambiguous or over-restrictive definition of the left as a concept. Philosophers, historians, and political scientists have all tried to give such a definition, but they all tend to use the term in different ways. It has also taken on different meanings depending on the era and geographical context. In my opinion, the concept of the left, like that of capital, should be seen as denoting not a thing or an essence, but a relationship between things, a phenomenon whose meaning is always relative. Every left has a right, and likewise every right has its left wing. Moreover, this relational dynamic has altered significantly over the last 2 centuries. We know that the appearance of the terms left and right was a quite contingent occurrence. When, on the 28th of August, 1789, the newly formed National Constituent Assembly of France set out to deliberate on whether to maintain the king's right of veto over the decisions of the nation's elected representatives. Opponents of the proposal gathered on the left side of the room, while supporters assembled on the right. But it would be several years before this left-right division became current in wider circles and took on its full meaning. What were the initial criteria for this classification? What does the existence of the left on a global scale owe to this particular historical moment? Concepts usually take root when new representations emerge, but that does not mean that the birth of these concepts is perfectly consistent with the emergence of the phenomena themselves. In the case of the left, the emergence of the concept must be viewed in parallel with that of equality, which at the time was taking hold in human consciousness. And the concept of equality always referred to things different from one another, not to a thing in itself. During the French Revolution, equality was one of the 3 great values brandished by the insurgents, along with liberty and fraternity. In the revolutionary trinity, liberty comes before equality, probably because it is a far older concept. According to biblical myth, the sons of Israel escaped from slavery to claim their liberty, and during the slave revolts in Rome, a resounding demand for liberty was often heard. In fact, within Mediterranean civilization, the notion had been a subject of debate since antiquity. Aristotle dealt with it in detail as early as the 5th century BCE. He also discussed equality, but only between free men. In the 17th century, Thomas Hobbes took up the subject in the form of the question of the liberty of subjects to accept voluntarily the domination of the Lord. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, the concept of liberty was increasingly defended by right-wing figures. For example, when Nazism was defeated, liberty was a central tenet of the political doctrines of both the left and the right in Europe. Indeed, the liberal right has always accused the left of posing a threat to civil and political liberties, and has not always been entirely wrong in doing so. As for the all-important idea of fraternity, its origins lie principally in the Christian tradition. In other words, in the notions of love, pity, and charity towards the weak and the poor. Although the modern left has adopted the notion in the form of solidarity, it cannot claim any monopoly on it. Nations have always been built on some sense of brotherhood between citizens. In all modern wars, for example, the brotherhood of combatants has been a cornerstone in the construction of national sentiment. Equality among all humans, on the other hand, must be understood as a central notion when trying to decipher the historical appearance of the left. In early agricultural societies, equality was not defined as a moral goal. No trace of it is to be found in the great hydraulic empires, from Mesopotamia to imperial China, nor in the slave societies of the Mediterranean, Greece and Rome, nor in the feudal European countries, from England to Russia. Similarly, although many believers may not want to hear this, none of the monotheistic religions ever raised any objection in principle to slavery. The former slaves of Egypt we read about in the Bible had themselves become legitimate slave owners in the Holy Land. Christians did not object to slavery either, and in their view the salvation of the soul always took precedence over that of the body. As for the Quran, although it recognizes the immortality of the slave's soul, it still accepts the basic inequality between master and slave. Just like the polytheistic faiths, from ancient Athens to Hindu India, monotheisms tended to regard the ownership of certain human beings as a natural fact and a guiding principle of the cosmic order. In Europe, Christianity did not speak out against serfdom, and served as an ideological and legal anvil for the extremely rigid hierarchical edifice of feudalism. Despite the presence of a great many expressions of pity and criticisms of the cruelty of arbitrary power, equality between humans has never been an integral part of the dogma of the great religions. We might therefore say that Friedrich Nietzsche was quite wrong to attribute the invention of the idea of equality to Christianity. On the threshold of the modern era, the demand for equality between humans was still in its infancy. Since equality did not exist in nature, the new moral standard had to rely heavily on models drawn from history. Nation builders made reference to the distant past so as to demonstrate the long lineage of the modern peoples whose rebirth they hoped to bring about. At the same time, various left-wing circles also drew upon the past to confirm the correctness of their ideological enterprises and their optimistic predictions for the future. For example, during the Civil War in 17th-century England, radicals imagined that before the conquest of their country by William the Conqueror, the Anglo-Saxons were entirely equal and lived in the tranquility of a pastoral society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the first thinkers of the idea of democracy in the 18th century, portrayed man as a noble savage in a state of nature, a creature imbued with the spirit of freedom and equality. According to Abbé Sieyès, author of What is the Third Estate, the Gallic tribes had lived without class distinction until the invasion of the Franks. The radical Jacobin François-Noël Babeuf was given the pseudonym Gracchus in order to endow his actions with the aura of the ancient Roman Republic's plebeian tribune. In the 19th century, when the anthropologist Lewis Morgan published his research on community life and equality in ancient tribal societies, Marx and Engels were quick to echo his findings with great enthusiasm. According to them, what was the rule in primitive society would again be the rule in a future communist society, but with the additional benefits of the material abundance created by the machines of progress. Karl Kautsky, Marx and Engels' official heir, also scoured the historical record looking to utopias of the past for ideas that heralded socialism and communism. From Plato's Republic, written in the 4th century BCE, through the Christian Gospels and the rules of the abbeys, to Thomas More's Utopia, published at the beginning of the 16th century, he discovered an abundance of collectivist ideas and criticisms of private property, visions which, according to him, had up until then not been realizable because economic production was not sufficiently developed. It should be pointed out that although the many historical examples discovered by these scholars do indeed include criticisms of private property and social and economic injustice, calls for generosity toward the poor, and exalted proclamations in favor of liberty, the idea of universal equality is entirely absent in them. Noblemen knew nothing of equality. The ancient Anglo-Saxon and Gaelic tribes were governed by strict hierarchical rules. Plato's Republic is an explicitly anti-egalitarian essay. Neither Solon the Athenian nor Lycurgus the Spartan imagined what equality might be like. In most slave revolts, the insurgents' aim was to turn the masters into their own servants. Monasteries have always respected clerical hierarchy, and even in More's Utopia, in which a sense of sharing predominates, slave ownership is still allowed, albeit subject to limits. The emergence of equality. So, what are the principal reasons for the gradual emergence of the myth of equality in the 17th century? Here I use the term myth in the sense defined by Georges Sorel, not a misleading or illusory image of the past or present, but a set of representations that serves to unite people and encourage them to take collective action. The first reason, in my opinion, is the waning of traditional agrarian structures across a large part of Western Europe, which first gave rise to an individual horizontal mobility of the individual. The expansion of agricultural production, following a significant improvement in practices linked to the introduction of new techniques, made possible a new division of labor which, in turn, led to unprecedented social mobility. These numerous changes in status and situation, although not always beneficial, altered mentalities in a way that had never been seen in other traditional agricultural societies. In particular, the enclosure movement in England and Wales from the 16th century onwards corresponds to the first primitive accumulation of capital, which at the same time considerably impoverished a great many peasants. It was not that revolutions caused the decline of the ancestral feudal order. Rather, it was the destabilization of the bonds of dependence and patronage that paved the way for a whole series of mass revolts and mutinies. The undermining of the feudal system of allegiance and vassalage, along with the decline of serfdom, together with the development of cities, the formation of capitalism, the growing emergence of a merchant class, and the constitution of new strata of rural and urban artisans, all profoundly altered the morphology of socio-economic power relations, as well as modes of thought and the sensitivity of individuals towards the fellow human beings living and working around them. Personal identities, always constituted in relation to the other, underwent decisive changes which fueled and accelerated a growing malaise. Whereas the traditional social stratification of agrarian society had for centuries been regarded as natural, the new, more flexible configuration suddenly seemed less understandable and far less legitimate. The ensuing period of social instability, along with the first cracks in religious beliefs that had hitherto cemented a hierarchical order by naturalizing it, prompted individuals to compare themselves to one another, not necessarily out of jealousy or frustration, marking the beginning of a new dynamic of social relations characteristic of the modern era. What significance should we attach to this still incipient norm of equality? In what sense did individuals feel or imagine that they ought to become the equals of other individuals? What was it about persistent inequality that at this point began to be seen as problematic? And in what sense was it felt that people should be equal, now or in the future? The myth of equality has taken various forms, sometimes complementary, sometimes at odds with one another. At the very beginning of this profound cultural change, for example, we find the demand for equal civil rights under the law, followed by the demand for political equality in the form of the sovereignty of the people, but also, almost in parallel, the aspiration for greater equality in the socio-economic field and equal accession to independence and self-determination for all peoples. Nowadays, demands for equality are expressed in the form of calls for equal opportunities in the education system, equality between peoples of different continents, equality between religions, cultures, genders, and sexes. All of this is increasingly understood and agreed upon. Over the course of contemporary history, then, the category of equality has been applied to multiple complex dimensions of life that are rather difficult to bring under a single conceptual umbrella. Today, are we witnessing a crisis of the various components of the myth of equality that would explain the disarray of leftist movements? I will try to answer this question in the conclusion of this book, if only partially. But before doing so, I want to sketch out an assessment, albeit inevitably brief and incomplete, of the successes and failures of the historical left. How dependent was the left in each country upon the legacy of the long-term relations of forces that preceded its arrival? How has the left continued to act within the framework of those forces and to reproduce it? In what areas has the ethic of equality become hegemonic, to the point where its values have become entrenched almost everywhere in the world? And how and why has it repeatedly failed, provoking strong counter-reactions? How did it come into conflict with political liberalism, colonialism, and nationalism? To what extent has the memory of the Gulag and authoritarian regimes that claimed to be communist paralyzed the left, considerably undermining hope and weakening the struggle for meaningful social progress? What positions has the left taken up in relation to the idea of equality between similar humans, and equality between those who are unlike one another? Do most calls for equality generally envision relative rather than full equality? How has the idea of progress been integrated into the myth of equality, even as the deterioration of this idea, linked to the sentiment that we are living on a near-exhausted planet, is further weakening the left today, making its work seem like a Sisyphean task? Of course, in this short essay, I do not claim to offer a detailed history of all the currents of the left worldwide. Several shelves of volumes would not be enough for that. I will therefore confine myself to mentioning central nodes, movements that have had an influence upon the history of the left, important figures, and, of course, significant events. I will begin this short journey by trying to clarify exactly when the left was born, and revealing how it took its first baby steps. I have chosen two starting points: the Civil War in mid-17th century England and the revolutionary philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which took shape in the subsequent century. This choice may seem rather arbitrary, as is necessarily the case with any historical choice, so I will try to give a brief justification of my choice in the first chapter. Chapter 1. From the Levelers to the Enigma of Rousseau. The first source of evil is inequality. From inequality came wealth. For those words, poor and rich, are relative, and everywhere that men are equal, there are neither rich nor poor. Jean-Jacques Rousseau replied to the King of Poland, 1751. As early as the 16th century, Europe saw major peasant revolts calling for the reduction of arbitrary taxes and the redistribution of land. Initially, this prolonged social unrest did not lead to a change of regime, but the brutal suppression of peasant uprisings left deep, lingering frustrations. Traditional conflicts and even outright battles between the nobility, the clergy, and royalty did not result in any revolutionary change, except for a reinforcement of monarchical absolutism on the threshold of the modern era. The great parliamentary uprising in the British Isles in the mid-17th century marked the beginning of a turning point in the history of socio-political conflict. Over a period of 10 years, supporters of the King of England came into conflict with supporters of Parliament, resulting in almost 100,000 deaths in a total population of about 5 million. The climax of this war saw not only the putting to death of the king, something which had happened in the past, but above all, for the first time in history, a public trial before his execution. The beheading of Charles I also marked the beginning of a breakdown of the old order that had characterized all traditional societies around the world. It would herald the execution of other kings and emperors, from France's Louis XVI to Russia's Nicholas II. Pu Yi, the last emperor of China, was not executed but re-educated to become a communist. However, the English MPs who tried the king and gave the world the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, nothing less than the inauguration of the politicization of the social classes, were not elected democratically and could not claim to represent the totality of the kingdom's subjects. Membership of this political grouping did not require election. It was passed down from father to son and maintained through the payment of land tax. Parliament was mainly composed of representatives of the new middle nobility, large landowners, lawyers appointed by the king in the major cities, leaders of various sects of Puritans hostile to the official church, and so on. Essentially, these were political and religious elites who opposed the absolute power of the king and who were supposed to represent society as a whole. This English insurrection, although it made possible the emergence of new political and revolutionary actors, was therefore not a historical event for which political equality was a guiding principle. The political omens of equality. The anti-absolutist elites found themselves obliged reluctantly to mobilize the wider masses around them in order to take on the king's army and bring about its defeat. It was at this point that what might be called a primitive left-wing movement appeared for the first time in history, in the form of the Levelers. They were not a political party with a platform or a set of policies, but their leaders wrote manifestos and petitions, held public debates, and even briefly, in 1649, published a pioneering newspaper, The Moderate. They recruited mainly from among minor craftsmen, weavers, shoemakers, printers, glassblowers, etc., as well as from among traders, professionals, and small and medium-sized farmers. Many of them enlisted in the new model army commanded by Cromwell and died in the fighting. Women also participated actively in the movement, writing their own petitions and organizing independent demonstrations. The principal figure within the Levelers was John Lilburne. Born into a low noble family and apprenticed to a Puritan tailor, Lilburne soon became a radical activist and was repeatedly arrested. He became famous for refusing to take an oath in court. While incarcerated, he began to write short texts which he smuggled out of prison. His religious faith did not stop him from launching increasingly virulent attacks against the church. He was also very vocal about the rights of the citizen and vigorously opposed the excesses of the legal system. In 1640, a petition to Parliament issued from his prison cell brought him to the attention of Cromwell, who, struck by its rhetorical quality, unhesitatingly took up Lilburne's cause, eventually securing his release. Lilburne was made a captain in the new parliamentary army at the beginning of the insurrection, but would not sign its solemn league and covenant. He refused to swear allegiance to any commanding authority. Lilburne eventually resigned and decided to devote his entire life to political action under the name Freeborn John. Lilburne's campaign against the House of Lords landed him in prison, but this did not stop him from continuing to publish pamphlets in favor of equality before the law and human rights. As his fame grew, so did the number of his supporters. In July 1646, he and other writers published A Remonstrance of Many Thousand Citizens, which may be considered the first
Sample complete. Ready to continue?